Welcome to the Sanctions Age, the podcast that explores how sanctions are changing the world. My name is Esfandiar Batmanghelidj. On December 8, 2024, Bashar Al-Assad fled Syria, bringing an end to the 13-year civil war that had devastated the country. Syrians who had endured years of conflict and deprivation took to the streets in celebration. They were suddenly able to imagine a new future. Assad's fall caught the international community by surprise, and leaders in the region, in Europe, in the United States, were forced to adjust their policies, opening lines of communication to Syria's new leader, Ahmad Al-Shaara. Over the last 6 months, one issue has dominated the debate over Syria policy: lifting sanctions. My guest today is a noted expert on the Syrian economy who has worked extensively on sanctions issues. Karam Shaar is the founder of Karam Shaar Advisory, a consulting company. He is currently the chief economic consultant to the Office of the United Nations Resident Coordinator in Syria and a senior consultant at the World Bank. He's also a non-resident fellow at the New Lines Institute. Karam, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great talking to you again.
So, Karam, I want to start by asking you how your life has changed in the last 6 months since the fall of Assad. I mean, what was it like to realize that after this long and really awful civil war, and after 13 years of Assad clinging to power, he had finally been ousted? And what has this meant for your personal and professional lives?
I mean, I would say quite literally my life flipped upside down because of the toppling of the regime. We were starting actually like in the past maybe 4 years, we started worrying that we are no longer even hoping to work towards the ending of that regime, but rather just manning the fort, making sure that the areas outside of Assad's control can live in dignity, that people do have access to basic services, that sanctions do not affect them, and so on and so forth. But the toppling of the regime, let's face it, I don't think anyone saw that coming, really. We all knew that the regime was extremely vulnerable, but we didn't know that there would be a point where someone would actually manage to launch a successful military operation and just end it. On a personal level, all of a sudden, I now can go to Syria after 13 years because I was wanted apparently by 4 security branches, not by one. That's what I was told when I reached the first time when I went from Jordan, actually. Mm-hmm. And now we can do a lot more work on the ground, which is also great. There's renewed interest in Syria and operating in the country, which is also fantastic. So all of a sudden, the context changed a lot, the actors changed a lot, and we're just struggling to keep up. But in general, exciting times.
So we'll get into a little bit of what your work has actually entailed and kind of what comes next. But before we do that, I thought it would be helpful to sort of set some background for the listeners. And so I wanted to ask you to explain for our listeners the nature of the Syria sanctions regime and the effects that these sanctions had on the Syrian economy. I mean, why were these sanctions imposed? Who were they targeting? And how did they affect the Syrian state, businesses, and households?
So Syria is under a stringent set of sanctions. Unlike other countries, I think there's a very clear distinction, which is Syria has never been under UN-wide sanctions. So unlike Iraq following its invasion of Kuwait, for instance, or North Korea, there are no UN-wide sanctions on Syria. However, unilateral sanctions include a very large number of layers. And the first layer actually started as early as 1979 with the invention of the designation of state sponsorship of terrorism. It took multiple years for Iran to be added to that list, but Syria was added as soon as the label was made and stayed on it.
Syria was the first.
The first, and stayed on it actually
I didn't realize
until
that.
now. So it's the only country that continues to be under that set of sanctions nonstop. So it's like it started then also following Bashar Al-Assad's rule in 2000. So with the US invasion of Iraq and Syria's sponsorship of terrorism and the facilitation of the flow of foreign fighters, then actually the assassination of Rafiq al-Hariri in Lebanon, additional sanctions started to be imposed, and the main set of sanctions was again in the form of an act from US Congress under the Syria Accountability Act in 2003. And then when the Syrian conflict began, sanctions just exploded in magnitude and scope. And this is when the EU started to impose sanctions. That before then, they threatened imposing Syria-specific sanctions, but they didn't. In May 2011, they started their sanctions, which proved to be extremely potent, given Syria's proximity to Europe economically compared to the US. The EU was Syria's number one market destination, for instance, for exports. Over 50% of exports used to go to the EU. And after 2011, so many other countries started to impose their sanctions. Switzerland, Canada, Australia, and so on and so forth. Then you had in 2019 a significant set of sanctions that was imposed, which is the Caesar sanctions. And those were particularly effective in the sense that they included a secondary element, well, an explicit secondary element, because many of the executive orders did have that element, but it was never stated in a legally binding, in such strong terms, from Congress, that your behavior would be sanctionable not only if you commit sanctionable behavior, but if you aid someone who's committing sanctionable behavior. So that's how complicated the sanctions are on Syria, and quite often they're really misunderstood, including by experts. They just do not really distinguish between like unilateral versus multilateral sanctions or terror listings, which we haven't really discussed here. In Syria, they used to be less relevant before Hayat Tahrir al-Sham controlled the entire country, but now they are extremely relevant, and their impact, if they're implemented as they can be much, much more stringent than other sets of unilateral sanctions. They can be nuclear active if the governments imposing them choose to implement them stringently.
And Karam, what were generally speaking the effects of these sanctions? So they sort of intensified over time. You described the major legislation in 2003, but then an intensification after the Civil War, and then really in 2019 with the Caesar Act. What was the pressure that these sanctions really brought to bear on the Syrian economy?
So, I think if we discuss the impact, we need to make sure we're discussing both positive and negative impacts. I know when it comes to sanctions, it's mostly negative, but we should never ignore the positive impact as well. I think in this context, sanctions played a genuine role in spelling the end of the Assad regime. I think sanctions played a pivotal role. They deprived the Syrian government from its number one source of revenue, which was oil. Over 90% of Syrian oil used to be exported to the EU, and then the EU decided, that's it, we're not buying oil from you anymore, which crippled state capacity, for good and for bad, So it like the entire state suffered, all state institutions, including the security apparatus, which weakened them to a point where a group of just 30,000 people could control the entire country, because no one was willing to lift a finger to defend the Assad regime with a salary of $30 per month, in part because of sanctions. Sanctions also helped isolate the Syrian regime diplomatically. It reinforced the image of a pariah state, which is great because that made many actors reluctant to engage with it. Now, when it comes to the negative impacts, where do I begin? So, unfortunately, they've acted like a wrecking ball. They're not laser focused, and unfortunately, this is not necessarily by design. It's by choice. It's because of the poor design of sanctions on the part of sanctioners. Those imposing the sanctions. But on the economy, they just, impacted everything, and every Syrian has felt their impact. I would say most importantly through the banking sector, financial dealings. Because while everyone keeps focusing on the humanitarian response and what the state could do to mitigate the impact of the conflict and so on, they forget that the main economic actor in the country was the private sector. And the private sector could not function without engaging with the rest of the world. How could they? So the banking sector played a pivotal role in just isolating the entire country from the rest of the world. It meant that small and medium enterprises can't actually work. Even if you manage to get a few solar panels and an internet connection, like satellite internet connection, you would still not be able to work on Upwork, for example, because you can't open a bank account. You can't use Google Suite or Zoom in Syria. When I arrived after 13 years, as I arrived, Facebook immediately logged me out and told me, hey, someone has hacked your account. I'm like, hey, wait, it's me, actually. So, so the negative impacts have been so severe. But one thing I will just leave you with is, quite often, when we talk about sanctions and their impact, not only do we forget to dissect the impact by actor and by sector and so on, but most importantly by time horizon. You know, what is the impact in the near term versus the long term? Because, if we can claim that these sanctions have indeed contributed to the toppling of the Assad regime, then maybe the suffering in the near term was worth it, was worth the gain, which is the end of that regime, a brutal regime that has killed hundreds of thousands of people.
I want to go back to this question of the contribution that sanctions may have had to toppling Assad. But before we do that, I want to kind of go into a little bit more detail about this issue of actually trying to understand the effects of the sanctions. And I think what you've described here already is very useful in that you're showing us that you have to think about different kinds of effects, positive and negative. You have to think about them on different time horizons. And, during the civil war, you were helping a lot of international organizations working in Syria to basically understand what was happening in the Syrian economy. And an example might be that if an aid organization wanted to understand how economic pressures might be impacting access or availability of food, then they might come to you and ask you to help develop that research. But obviously, and I think it's already something you've raised, you would face a challenge in that project because you have to try and disentangle the effects of the sanctions from the effects of an actual conflict, a civil war that was taking place, and then also the effects of policymaking by the Assad regime and mismanagement that would probably be attributed to them. So how did you try and approach this challenge? I mean, as an economist studying Syria during the civil war, during the sanctions, during Assad's rule, how were you navigating the attribution of different kinds of effects to different causes?
Quite often in economics, this is not peculiar to Syria or the field of sanctions. We cannot really establish causality. We quite often claim that we can, but it's much, much harder than, say, in medicine, where you can have a genuine control group, you can study the placebo effect, you can work out the exact impact, somehow the exact impact of your medicine in a living organism like a society, like the economy, like politics. It's just difficult by construction. Now, it gets much more difficult when it comes to sanctions as well because of endogeneity, because you have multiple factors that are having an impact, and because of the time horizon of the impact again. So it's not like you impose sanctions and then you can say, okay, let me see what happened over the first year. Well, not necessarily. Maybe the impact could take longer than that. In some other types, it could take shorter than that. So now, not all is lost. We can still try to get some helpful signals and try to attribute cause and effect. For example, can we say that the designation of Syria as a state sponsor of terrorism, or the Syria Accountability Act, can we say that they have resulted in Syria's isolation, banking isolation. Well, we know for a fact that they were imposed before the conflict, and we know that at the onset of the conflict, Syria had a functional banking sector. Yes, transactions were relatively more expensive than in other countries, but it was fully functional. You could use SWIFT with no problems, like in the vast majority of cases. So that is one example where you can really tease out the impact. So I know some sanctions that existed before the current case, and then I can say, well, then sanctions might have contributed to Syria's banking isolation, but they couldn't be the main factor. In other cases, you can use geographic isolation. So you say, I know that GL-22 was introduced because we wanted to isolate northern Syria from the regime-held Syria in terms of like sanctions impacts. So then we can study the difference in behavior, in these two regions and how each of them diverged. Ceteris paribus, of course. I mean, assuming that nothing else has changed, which is like quite often never the case, as you know better than I. But yeah, so I mean, we do try to have this kind of small cases where we try to work out the impact. One other thing that I think is quite helpful is also quite simply understanding what the sanctions are saying. It sounds like such a basic thing, but believe it or not, quite often you talk to people who also pose as experts who have really never actually sat and read all of these sanctions legislations, all executive orders. It's a very difficult task. It's a very time-consuming task.
I'm not sure I've read all of the sanctions legislation or all of the executive orders, so I have some homework now.
I think that knowledge is also relative, right? You're not supposed to just sit and read every single one of them, but at least when we read them and know what they target, what they don't target, we can also have another signal that, well, maybe this is because of sanctions, this is not really because of sanctions. And this had huge implications. My apologies for the long reply here, but it had very strong implication in politicizing the impact of sanctions, So quite often you would see people, because it's all blurry, because we really don't know exactly for sure scientifically what the impact of sanctions is. We have a general idea, but we don't know for sure. That meant that if you want to make the case for Bashar al-Assad, you can hide behind sanctions and just blame them for everything. And good luck making sure that I am factually wrong. It's just not possible.
So, Karam, I mean, one of the things that we also need to discuss is the fact that the sanctions have largely been lifted. And I think this is also something that is remarkable in its own right. And we had this dynamic where almost immediately after Assad's fall, there were calls for the sanctions to be removed. And the logic was that these were sanctions that had been imposed to target his regime and to accelerate his ouster. When he was out of power, then it made no sense to maintain them on Syria. But at first, in the first kind of couple months of the year, it really looked like European and American policymakers, and you had mentioned before that the sanctions on Syria were essentially unilateral, so there were different programs from different countries, that these policymakers were poised to take a kind of phased approach to sanctions relief, that they were going to impose some conditions and say to the transitional authorities in Syria, unless you do X, Y, and Z, we won't be lifting these sanctions. And then suddenly the consensus shifted and we found ourselves in a situation where in February, the EU suspended its sanctions, and then a couple weeks later, President Trump is giving a speech in Riyadh, and he sort of catches everyone off guard when he makes a commitment that the US is also going to lift all of the sanctions on Syria. And in his words, he wanted to give Syria a chance. Why do you think that the sanctions were lifted more quickly than I think most people expected?
That's an excellent question. I think there's a combination of factors, but I think Syrians actually deserve most of the credit. They have worked tirelessly to convince politicians in Western countries that sanctions should be lifted, that this is the only moral thing to do, that this is the only course of action that is consistent with international law, actually. You do not punish like a government for the sins of bygone regime. That it's against the interests of the countries imposing these sanctions. You know, if you really want to work on refugee return, for example, the best way to achieve it is to help the country to recover economically. And these sanctions are suffocating the economy. But I think for the Europeans, it took a lot of work. And actually, the very last step in the EU that effectively ended all sanctions came after Trump's announcement,
Yes.
not before it.
Yeah.
Before it, they made an announcement that included the easing of some sanctions, but really numerous sectoral impacts remained, and we can talk about the nitty-gritty. The actual lifting or near total lifting happened a few weeks later in May. And
In part because, sorry to interrupt, Karam, but in part because Trump's commitment had gone further than theirs, so they were sort of trying to catch up to him.
that's right, exactly. And we were just trying to make the case that forget about Syrians, forget about what's morally right, forget about international law. This is just against your own interests. Why would you do that, you know? And it's not like you're depriving yourselves from a policy tool that you could never regain. You can. Mm-hmm. You can impose sanctions again, you know, for a new set of violations if they are committed by the new government. And you have concerns about this new government. We have 10 times more concerns than you, but it's a separate point. You know, why would you keep sanctions that are no longer relevant? Here, I can tell you, for instance, that in the EU, there were internal discussions, and some countries were arguing for not only keeping sanctions, but even strengthening them. They wanted to use them as a tool of leverage. For instance, Cyprus was trying to do that because they were worried that any maritime demarcation between Syria and Turkey could affect their access to natural gas in the Mediterranean, you know? I mean, using sanctions for a completely irrelevant objective as well. So what Syrians did was we drafted a letter, and we got civil society organizations to sign it. Over, I think, 140 organizations signed it, all the major ones, basically. And that helped us make the case to the EU, and mostly for organizations that are based in the EU, that this is our position. This is what we want you to do. And I think, yeah, like the stars all lined up properly, and it worked. For the US, I think there is a chance that despite the announcement, we might not be headed in that direction. You know, there's still so much pressure from within the US administration, in my opinion, to keep some of the sanctions, at least terror listings. Yes, there are now multiple pushes for lifting statutory sanctions in US Congress, which is great. Executive sanctions have, for the most part, been lifted, except for terrorism. And if those stay in place, they do have a very significant impact on the economy, especially if the targeted individuals and entities are the ones who are running the country.
And Karam, I mean, you've described that obviously Syrian civil society advocates played this really important role in explaining to Western policymakers that there was no point in making the sanctions relief conditional or in dragging this process out. But in order for the sanctions relief to actually proceed or to be conceivable, there were things that the Syrian transitional authorities also had to do. So when you look at the steps that Ahmad Al-Shaara and his kind of administration have taken to give the Western policymakers a degree of trust or give them an opening to at least consider sanctions relief? I mean, what are those steps that they took, and what do you make of their approach to this challenge of economic reconstruction?
I think the government has done spectacularly well. I didn't expect them to manage to win over all of these actors at once, because they have very contradictory interests. You know, to get the Russians and the Americans and the Europeans and the Saudis and the Emiratis, the Qataris and the Turks to advocate for you is mind-boggling. To me, I genuinely still fail to understand how they managed to pull that off, you know? I think it required a lot of smart work, you know, delaying some big questions, refusing to discuss, for instance, Russia's military presence in the country. Maybe if they talk to the Russians, they say something. If they talk to the Americans, they say something else. But the way they managed not to antagonize any key actor, Iran included, you know, I mean, the main actor that I think most people in Syria who were opposed to Bashar al-Assad had such a negative position towards is Iran, and yet the government did not really antagonize them, you know? So I think that played a huge role. But also, I mean, I think the role that the Saudis played, without it, I don't see anything, like I don't see the US moving this quickly. Yeah, I think that's what they've managed to do right. They've been quite open on the issue of chemical weapons, for instance. Just come, inspect. If there are any remnants, please come and take them. They're working like openly with all international agencies with respect to, say, the missing persons, detainees, and so on and so forth. So I think they've done a very, very good job, given that they've never governed before, basically, except for the enclave in Idlib. And the time period that we're talking about is remarkably short.
And so they've made this big diplomatic push. And as you say, I think they've been, you know, very successful in balancing the interests of all these larger powers. But I guess the question then becomes, you know, why was it so urgent for these transitional authorities to rebuild these diplomatic relationships and also try and push for sanctions relief? And here I think the question becomes really, you know, what does sanctions relief mean for the Syrian economy? There's been a lot of analysis in recent months that points out that simply lifting sanctions is not going to be enough to get the Syrian economy back on track, given the scale of the devastation from the civil war and the state of the economy, and the fact that the private sector can't just rebuild Syria on its own. The country needs significant investment and aid. So what's the connection between the lifting of sanctions, securing the investment and aid, and then crucially, how does the economic re-engagement play into this bigger question of political transition in the country?
Unfortunately, if I just start from where you finished, so political transition, it's a shame that I see, because of the charm offensive that the Syrian government has been doing since they assumed power, practically no one is talking about political transition. You know, everyone is just rushing in to guarantee their interests, to make sure the country is stable, the country is safe. It's no longer a source of, say, terrorism or refugees and so on. But political transition, I feel basically only the UN is working on that. So at the moment, everyone is looking at their own interests above all. And in that sense, sanctions lifting, as I always say, and as we studied in mathematics, is a necessary but insufficient condition for recovery. You know, without it, like with sanctions in place, there's no way the country is going to recover economically. But if you lift them, the country would not necessarily recover because of the other factors that you mentioned. Just to explain why the country wouldn't recover with sanctions in place, well, because of mainly investment and banking. How can you do either of these while there are sanctions? Now, with them being lifted, it would need a lot. Like we would still need a period of time for adjustment, for the market to realize that they're lifted. This is assuming they're actually lifted. And by the way, I would also add something that I mentioned early on, and I said Syria has never been under UN sanctions. This is not really true just for HTS, you know, just for terrorist groups.
Sure.
So now you can say that, yeah, maybe it's under UN sanctions because of the 1267 regime.
Yes.
But that was a non-state actor, until just 6 months ago. Now the group is in power, and it depends on who you're asking really now whether they are in power or not. Because, like some would argue that the group is completely gone. Anyway, back to your question. I felt like I need to make that clarification. So I think we would need time. Assuming all sanctions are lifted, we would need a significant amount of time, and then you need additional things. You mentioned funding, but I think what's more important than funding is clarity around the outlook, for good or for bad, just clarity, knowing where the country is actually headed. That is the bare minimum for investment. And I think the third factor is the regulatory framework. Currently, the country, because it was basically 4 different control areas, each one of them had its own regulatory framework, its own set of laws. And that meant that now you have this fragmentation. I think even if all laws are unified again and you have one set of rules that is smart, that supports economic recovery, you would still have the other problem, which is the fact that these regulatory frameworks are often disrespected, because of rampant corruption. So even if the laws are known, quite often you can just circumvent them and do whatever you want.
I think the point about sanctions relief being necessary but not sufficient, really captures it. There's this larger process that now has to get underway, which is around the question of how you do early recovery in the economy, how you then create a roadmap for fuller reconstruction. And then it's not just, it's commercial activity, but it's also institutional reform. It's an enormous kind of task for the new Syrian authorities to undertake. And I hope that they are as adept at this set of reforms as they've proven to be at diplomacy in the last sort of 6 months. But I want to shift gears a little bit and go to, I think, the thing that we talked about earlier in the conversation, which is this reassessment of the role that sanctions may have played in bringing about Assad's fall. And I think when I was envisioning sort of our conversation, this is the part that I was most intrigued by and most sort of curious to get your take on, because I think intellectually it's incredibly important for our understanding of kind of this question of the effectiveness of sanctions moving forward. So obviously everyone working on Syria policy, rightly so, is looking to the future. But those of us who work on sanctions policy, I think, are thinking a little bit about, okay, well, what does the events of the last sort of year tell us about the ability of sanctions and their efficacy to work in different ways on different time frames. So I want to go back to November 2024, before Assad fell. And at the time, and this is my view, and feel free to correct me if you think the consensus was different, but my sense was that there was a consensus that Assad had largely adapted to the sanctions pressure, that the sanctions had certainly had a very significant economic impact on the regime, in addition to the country at large, but that certain choices had been made by Assad and his circle to try and find new sources of revenue. So, for example, the regime was very involved in the production of Captagon, a narcotic, which is something that you've written about extensively, and this gave a new source of revenue that to an extent offset the fact that, for example, the country was no longer to export oil. And as you also mentioned earlier, we were in a moment where it looked like the, normalization of Assad was underway, that he was going to remain in power, and there was even a conversation about trying to loosen sanctions in some areas. Some actors act motivated because they wanted to reduce the humanitarian harm for the areas not under control of Assad, but other actors actually recognizing that pushing normalization forward would require a certain level of economic engagement, which also required some sanctions relief. So, take us back to November 2024. What was the consensus about sort of the effectiveness of the sanctions in Syria at that point while Assad was still in power?
Yeah, I mean, the consensus among whom? So in academia, I think the general consensus is, and I would trust their methodologies more than those involved in policy circles. The consensus was, yeah, these are like the cost outweighs the benefit big time, you know. But if you look at it from a political point, as I mentioned before, if your main metric was the downfall of the regime, you just don't care about society, you don't care about equality, you don't care about the stability of the transitional period after the regime is gone, then sanctions have done a good job, you know, in ending the regime. Now, obviously, I'm not saying this is what we should focus on. I'm saying they resulted in a huge societal, like negative societal impact, but ultimately they did contribute to the ending of the regime. But how do I then, position this next to what you mentioned, which is the regime has adapted? I would say the regime has survived sanctions. It did not thrive under sanctions.
Sure.
So that meant that everyone was weaker. Everyone in Syria got weaker. Well, all Syrians really, even abroad, got weaker because of sanctions. It's just that the regime got weaker at a slower pace, you know? So it remained relatively stronger, but it was so weak that actually 30,000 fighters could take it down. So it was relatively stronger, and it was able to continue to survive these sanctions, but not thrive. So here I see is like where quite often the misunderstanding happens. People think and often make the case that the regime has not been affected by sanctions. Actually, look at their cars, look at their palaces, and so on. I'm like, that's just so naive. No, of course they have been affected. Of course they're struggling economically. The entire country is. And the fact that they continue to have palaces is what to be expected in authoritarian regimes. Of course, they would try to cover themselves first, but they were struggling to serve the key function of key functions of state institutions, which spelled their end ultimately. Now, if I zoom out and look at sanctions in general, you know, as a policy tool, I think, and I've always been arguing this, that sanctions can be much, much more helpful if sanctioners pay more attention to the way they're designing them, you know? So I will never argue for just stopping the use of sanctions as a policy tool, as many people would argue. To my mind, this is just way too extreme for no good reason. I think if you actually use sanctions strategically, surgically, in a way that, I mean, you can maximize their impact and minimize their side effects. Now, I think the listeners would say, what do you mean, really? Can you tell me what that actually means? I would say, for instance, we should never, ever target the banking sector of a country. It's a dumb idea. You should not do that. You're shooting yourself in the foot if you do that, because you're just helping a parallel system to thrive. And there you have zero visibility. At least through formal channels, you do have some visibility. Here you have no visibility. So you're fueling the black market. What you can do instead is do a lot of OSINT work, do a lot of spying, actually, even on these individuals that are committing the violations, on corrupt politicians, on like whoever you want to target. And I think there you can maximize the pain. You can inflict so much pain with targeted sanctions if you pay attention to them. Quite often, as you know better than I, again, in Iran and in Syria as examples, quite often sanctions are just imposed for political signaling. You know, it's a political messaging tool as opposed to a genuine tool for behavioral change. So, and we see it happening just time and again. In the US, for example, they sanctioned someone for his involvement in Captagon 6 months after he died, you know? Why? Well, because the bill was introduced 6 months before. It didn't make it back then, and then it was brought back on, and they sanctioned a dead person. Now you have someone who was sanctioned just yesterday by the EU. Again, his name is Ghiyath Dalla. He's sanctioned under Ghaith Dalla. Both are Arabic names for two completely different names. So you see that there's generally very little interest in how these sanctions are imposed. I think if they're imposed well, they can have a very, very positive impact with much fewer side effects.
I mean, that would require a fundamental rethink of how sanctions design works, given that, the general approach at the moment is to use financial sanctions and to leverage the banking sector to create this economic pressure, whether or not the programs are targeted. But I mean, I want to go into a little bit more detail on this question of the mechanism. So, I think what you've described is that there was a view up until Assad's fall that Assad was surviving the sanctions. He was certainly not thriving. There was absolutely economic pressure on the regime. He had survived by making certain choices, finding other sources of revenue, maybe enabling individuals who were loyal to him to engage in corruption that kept kind of the state, what we might call the state, operating. But you describe this also, this situation where the regime was failing to serve key functions of the state. And so to me, that sounds like, in a sense, the economic pressure of the sanctions had been somewhat absorbed by the Assad regime. But key functions speaks to me to an institutional role of the state, the ability to maintain institutions, maintain authority over those institutions, and to run the affairs of the state. And so it sounds like even if the economic pressure was absorbed, the decisions that Assad made to absorb that pressure might have eroded the institutions of the state. So to give an example, if you are finding new sources of revenue by becoming a narco state, that may not be the formula for having a kind of loyal and secure set of institutions that are working to keep you in power. How do you look at that dynamic? I mean, what might be the mechanisms that explain how an economic set of tools like sanctions would weaken a state at this more institutional level? And if that's what happened, is it the case that Assad could have made different decisions in his response to the sanctions that might not have eroded his authority so much so that 30,000 fighters were sufficient to topple him when they finally kind of decided to make an offensive?
It's an amazing question. I think the way you described it is exactly right. So as a coping mechanism, when you make very simple actions illegal, say the action of selling your own oil, as is the case in Iran at the moment, where then you basically force these benign activities, force them to become malign, so it becomes a clandestine operation to sell oil, not drugs, but oil, your own resource. And I think, by the same token, what happened in Syria, as it was deprived from all licit sources of income, given the brutality of the Assad regime, I would blame no one but the regime that it resided to these illicit activities. But we should have seen it coming, when you deprive the state from all of these licit sources, it has to create an alternative source of revenue. The weakening of the state, in my opinion, happens as follows. As you try to survive, you cannot actually do it through this main body that is the state that becomes rotten, that becomes there's ghost employees. It's too heavy, it's irresponsive, it's falling back in terms of technology, and so on. So you start creating a parallel state. And this is when the failure begins. You create a parallel state that helps maintain your own power, because that's the number one objective. You want to keep the state functioning, that's the secondary objective, because without it, you fall, you and the state. So, but your number one function is to survive on a personal level. What they've done is the same thing that has been happening time and again in countries that are targeted by sanctions. In North Korea, in Cuba, in Iraq, in Iran, in Syria, which is these regimes adapt by creating a parallel system that has nothing to do with the state. So, and that parallel system, we wrote something for Brookings, for instance, in August last year, just explaining how the Syrian regime was operating that parallel system. You, for example, start creating companies, shell companies, that are effectively owned by the palace, and then you get these companies to cannibalize the state sector. You go and get the airline carrier, you get the 5G operator, and so on and so forth. And this is, in my opinion, how it happens.
Karam, I want to turn back to your work as we wrap up. And I think, for the listeners, it's important for them to realize that you're in this really special position right now, because essentially you're advising these institutions in Syria on how to rebuild the country. And I'm sure you feel some weight of responsibility in this role. And I think also there's a sense that I've heard from you and others in Syrian civil society who are contributing to this important moment for the country, that there's kind of this opportunity to try and make this work and get the country back on track. What are your key priorities and projects for this year? And, where do you hope that the country will be in a year's time? You mentioned the importance of having some sense of the outlook. I mean, what is the outlook that you have for Syria?
So what we're working on at the moment is mostly economic work. So we're working on sanctions, producing macroeconomic analysis, contextual analysis. We map all actors in Syria. We've been doing this over the past 5 years, and we continue to do it for all new appointees in the country. We catalog all decisions that are made by the state, and now we're using AI tools to also analyze all of this wealth of information to see how the state is acting, how it's adapting. But if I zoom out and focus on the big picture, not what we are doing, I feel we are dealt a very bad hand. And while it's good that Bashar Al-Assad is gone, it's good that we can at least go back to our countries. I feel, in general, Syria's chances for a transition to democracy are grim, to be honest. And I think they're grim in part because of sanctions, but mainly because of other factors. You have a very low level of wealth. And in general, the international literature suggests that GDP per capita is one of the key determinants of success in a transition. So when people are poor, they just really don't care much about who is representing them in parliament and whether their intellectual priorities are met or not, because they would like to meet their more basic needs. In terms of education, the country has suffered big time. In terms of indoctrination, just people having sets of beliefs that are really not consistent with democratic principles, with pluralism, and so on. So on that front, I'm not optimistic. I believe we should try to help the country develop in terms of livelihoods, economically, while trying to push the country on a sustainable democratic path. But we shouldn't prioritize that democratic path over anything else, because we could fall back into conflict. And the current situation is extremely fragile. So I believe we should bet on the long term. We should try to push the country in that direction with what I said in mind. Economically, I worry that the current government is business friendly to an unhealthy level. The previous government was not business friendly at all, which was also bad. But then again, unfortunately, as we see happen in so many revolutions, you see those who basically topple the previous regime just revolting on the entire value system without really telling which features they actually disagree with. If you were socialist, then we're capitalist. And if you're secular, then we're religious, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, I just worry that the government is now landing on the other extreme, which is, let's get businesses at any cost. We will make it as desirable for investors as possible. It's going to be Singapore, But no one is really talking about the poor, about social welfare, about health, about education. And these are extremely important for the stability of the transition, and it worries me when we're talking about privatization in a context like Syria, because we all know who is going to come and take these assets, the select few who are politically connected, who will just come and take state institutions. In that sense, I'm worried, but at least, as we say in Syria, maybe that's not a very appropriate term here, but uglier than basically it just says uglier than what we got under Bashar al-Assad, it could never be, as my friend once told me, even if Hermit the Frog rules us, we would be better off.
Karam, we've reached the end of our time, which means I need to ask you the final question I ask every guest on the show. When did you realize that sanctions are changing the world?
When I started working on Syria, there was a point in 2019 where I left my work at the New Zealand Treasury and decided, okay, that's it. I want to dedicate my work to Syria and its political economy. And then I basically realized there is no way I could understand where Syria is headed, why we arrived here without understanding sanctions first.
Karam, thank you for this great discussion. I think I speak on behalf of all of the listeners to say that we're rooting for you and your colleagues and your fellow Syrians to get through this next chapter.
Thank you very much.
I'm Esfandiar Batmanghelidj, and this has been The Sanctions Age. Our show is produced by Spiritland Productions. Thanks for listening.